Good afternoon from Great Falls, Virginia. This is the third episode of the podcast, The Upstanding Rector and the Curious Christian. David is the upstanding rector. He is the rector of Great Falls St. Francis Episcopal Church and has been in that position for several years, has over 20 years experience in ministry. And I'm Kathy Wallman. I'm a retired lawyer and a curious Christian. The question we're going to explore today is, when you go into an Episcopal church, you might see on a Sunday sort of slow motion aerobics, people standing, sitting, kneeling, repeating the cycle in different forms. And so today we're going to talk about why do we do that. In preparing for this episode, I looked at some resources online, and people say things like, well, we worship with our bodies, or we adopt these postures because they signify reverence, they signify a penitential attitude, they signify a receptive attitude. But they're very carefully placed. They're not scattershot through the liturgy. They're very carefully placed. And what's expected of us is described in the rubrics, the little instructions in between parts of the liturgy. So David, what do you make of this? Why do we do this sit, stand, kneel?
So I'm with some of the people that you probably read. I think our posture as we pray and commune with God makes a difference. So if you were doing meditative prayer, as an example, or even if you were doing some sort of exercise, meditative exercise that was not prayer, most practitioners will tell you to assume a certain position that allows you to be present to yourself and to what's going on around you. And many people will tell you, you sit in a chair appropriately, not with your back against it and slouched down, but so your body is both erect and relaxed at the same time, so you can be centered. Other traditions might ask you to sit sartorially on the floor, and be otherwise saying cross-legged, and hold yourself again erect. So part of it is posture matters when you're trying to meditate, and I think posture matters when we're gathered together. So the Episcopal Church, when it reformed its worship services as it did in the 1979 prayer book, they were very aware of body posture, and part of that was a response to Tridentine worship, and that means worship within the body of the Council of Trent. And so, in response to the Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church called the Council of Trent. I cannot remember, you caught me off guard, the exact date of the Council of Trent, but it was in the 16th century. And they were trying to react to what was happening in the Protestant churches. So they came up with a more coherent form of worship. And Tridentine worship tended to, it was interesting, be quasi-individual worship in a group setting. So people were not necessarily focused on the whole body of the faithful people. The faithful people were coming and gathering where the Mass was being said, and quite often it was either most often, if there were no chairs, which was true in many cathedrals at the time, you stood through the whole period. And then once pews were introduced, quite often you were kneeling through the whole, a lot of the church service. So I think, and there were reasons for that, and then there were reasons why we chose to assume other positions. Many of these choices were based on reading and studying early liturgical documents like the apostolic tradition, or documents like that which were from 2nd century Rome to sort of ask, well, how did the early church people worship? That was a long interlude. Sorry, you've been very quiet. So
So in the modern worship form, maybe we could go through a typical service and why you'd assume that posture at that time.
sure.
So when the procession enters and makes its way to the altar, we stand.
Right.
Even if there's no procession, we stand upon the signal of the presider.
Right.
And I suppose the rationale is that calls attention to the beginning of worship. If there's a crucifer in the procession, you're honoring the crucifer and the crucifix as it passes by. And then we sit to hear the Old Testament.
Okay. So let's look at the beginning of the church service, Eucharistic service. Now, I apologize, and you may have to cut this out, Kathy. It's hay fever season in Virginia, so
It's always some season in Virginia.
Well, if you don't like the weather in Virginia, wait, it'll change, but that's true in many, many places. So, so I have turned in my prayer book to sort of set myself up. The prayer book, Book of Common Prayer, gives no instruction as to exactly how you start. So back in the day when we did morning prayer, and I always go back to that because in the 28 prayer book, so before 1979 in many Episcopal churches, we were worshiping in morning prayer. You didn't always start with any kind of processional. It's also true that if you're in the Eucharistic service, you have to start the service, but it doesn't specifically tell you how. And there are only two worship services that it implies or states that a procession might be held. One would be Palm Sunday, or the Sunday of the Passion narrative as well. And the other point would be in the funeral service. So the prayer book is silent with regard to what happens at the beginning of just your average, ordinary Eucharistic service, and it says a hymn, psalm, or anthem may be sung. So it also gives you a choice. What do you do to start the service? Well, you can start with a hymn, psalm, or anthem. Some of those are particularly appropriate to be singing while you're processing. Mm-hmm. Many churches, especially after the reforms of 1979, decided, processionals, let's go with processionals. And so they definitely developed processional worship. And that would entail all of the people walking in. It's a big parade. It's like Palm Sunday. Mm-hmm. And then, as I was once told, it's a truncated procession because in most churches, it only includes crucifer, quite often some acolytes, hopefully the gospel book, followed by choir, and then a whole bunch of other people. And then the most important group of people are already seated, and that would be the congregation. So the congregation should be in the place of honor, not the bishop, not the priest, but the congregation. Mm-hmm. And the way we do it is they're already sitting down, so we leave them out. Except on Palm Sunday, where they follow in procession of the leading altar party. And then they come in and sit down, and we have a song in the Episcopal Church, All Glory, Laud, and Honor, or some other hymn, as it says, like it is sung. And so it's supposed to be really festive. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure all places sing it as festively as it's anticipated. But again, all of this is, there was a book written a few years ago by an Episcopal priest, and he talked about worshiping with all our senses. And so really in worship, especially in ancient worship, I know Episcopalians, many of whom come from a very Protestant strain, aren't really fond of this, but smells. So Easter lilies are appropriate, but also in higher Episcopal churches, they'll have incense. The smells are part of worshiping with all our senses. Movement within the church is worshiping with all our senses. Seeing things is worshiping with all our senses. Hearing things is worshiping. Responding is worshiping. So the procession is one of those things where you're doing it all at once. You're moving through three-dimensional space. You're singing. If you've got incense, you're floating the incense in front of you. I know the people at St. Francis will probably be turning off their podcasts at this point, going, "He's advocating incense." No, I'm not, but I'm just saying that is one of the things. So you walk in, and you do so with excitement, with anticipation, with hopefulness. You're coming into God's presence, and that's a process that happens throughout the worship service. So that's how you begin. Or some places, I have friends who are in different places, different sorts of communities. There's one community where it's a little rural place in Vermont, and it's a small church, maybe 50 people on a Sunday, and they all come in and greet each other. And then finally, the priest kind of walks in shaking hands, and then goes to her place at the front of the church and begins it that way. So, and that fits their context, by the way. So I think they expect sort of an acknowledgement that this is a real community, and that's really important. Some processional beginnings are much more formal, more along the lines of, official state circumstances, like the church was when it began under Constantine. Boy,
But it sounds like the processional, even if it's not explicitly linked to a festival, can be a very participatory thing. Even though you're standing in your pew, you participate in the excitement of worship beginning.
Right. And the other part about it is both the processional space and the procession itself should be thought out when they're done. But if you're doing a processional, part of the purpose of the processional is to draw you into the worship service and to focus your attention on where the most important things are. So yes, we have a cross. In most Episcopal, and often in many Episcopal churches at this point, and in many Roman Catholic churches, you have a tabernacle as well. So one of the things that would happen is when you come in and the tabernacle is occupied by already consecrated bread and wine, that means that's where Jesus is. Because in both traditions, we hold that once it's been blessed, the real presence of Christ is there. And we both have different ways of explaining it, but that once it's the real presence, it should be honored as if Christ is really there. Now, I will tell you expansively, that's not the only way and only moment in which I think Christ can be present in a worship service. But by definition, if Christ is not present at any other moment, he's present there. And the cross, which signals to us the work of Christ, leads on and brings us in. By the way, my advocacy for the gospel book there, that's our story. That's the second most important thing that's happening in a Eucharistic service. And in fact, our services are divided into two parts, the Word and the Eucharist. And therefore, it should be a prominent display, because in the Episcopal Church, both aspects make the whole and are important to the process. So, as you're going in, even individual members of the service have different aspects of their posture and their movement that should signal and signify certain things. So the job of the procession is to pull people into the worship space and to highlight where we're going.
So shortly after the commencement of the service, we're into the Old Testament readings.
Right.
And why is it that we sit to hear the Old Testament readings and we stand to hear the gospel?
Okay, so we actually sit to hear two different types of readings, the Old Testament and the New Testament that is not a gospel reading.
Right.
So we have 3 readings in the Episcopal Church. That's part of the tradition, the ancient tradition. There have been times it's 2. If you're going to have a Eucharist, you have to have the gospel. So we're getting into the narrative story. So after we've done all the opening acclamation, we've said, we're here for you, God. Please be present for us. That's a lot of what's happening in the back and forth that goes on at the beginning of a worship service. We then get into, okay, now it's time to hear the story.
Mm-hmm.
And most people, when you're gathering around the house to hear your story of your family stuff and share things like that, what do? Well, you sit down. Mm-hmm. And yet, when you're sitting, it should not be like, okay. And I'm sometimes always amazed with people and the way they sit in church. But I will say, I think that to listen effectively, you should be sitting in anticipation of hearing. And so it's an honorable position. By the way, in the ancient church, preachers often preached sitting in a chair.
Interesting.
They did not go up into a pulpit. They sat in the chair in the middle of the chancel, and they had the Bible or the gospel book open in front of them, and they preached from the book. And therefore, so sitting is a way of being prepared and steady. And let's admit it, everybody kind of gets tired standing on their feet. They're shuffling around. So this gives you a chance. Sit down. Now let's engage. And so we listen to the Old Testament lesson and we listen to the New Testament lesson, generally epistles, sometimes Revelation, a lot of Paul in there, and sometimes the Acts of the Apostles. And we listen and we receive and we hear the story of the church and our faith. And then we prepare. And I know we sometimes say that we have a thing, there's a piece of music that happens in between the second reading, which is the epistle or other New Testament reading, and the gospel reading. And I'll get to what we do with the gospel in just a moment. And there's often a thing called a sequence. Well, we say often in our part of the church, oh, we have a sequence hymn. Well, no, those aren't really sequences. Those are just hymns. Sequences are specific types of music that can be sung while moving. They are repetitive, and they're pulling you into that place where you're about to hear the gospel. Mm-hmm. We actually have some sequences in our hymnal, but they appear in the service music. And then, but most parishes that I know sing a hymn, sort of connected to whatever the gospel reading is, theologically or some other way. And what happens in that is we honor the gospel because it's the story of Jesus. So we honor it more than the other works because we're Christians. And so we have in many places, we have some sort of gospel procession. Now at St. Francis, our procession is very short, and it goes from the altar table where the book has been placed to one of the lecterns. There was a time when we had more acolytes, and our gospel procession could be a real procession of some sort. And we had the crucifer and everybody, and we'd gather up and we'd walk out into the middle of the congregation and hold the book up and read from the book there. And in recognizing this, and that this is the most important part of the liturgy of the word moment, people stand up. And that would be another thing too. So posture opens us to certain things. So if we're standing, we're really connected to what's happening around us and all the people around us and what's happening within them. Now, I know one of the things we do in the Episcopal Church is we give people the readings to look at. And that's my fault, we probably shouldn't give them the readings to look at. We should make them hear. Mm-hmm. Because hearing through reading is different than just hearing. Mm-hmm. And then, we're talking about different types of training and all this other stuff. And we have found one way to overcome bad sound systems is by sound systems and sometimes hesitant readers is by giving people so they can read it. But, we really would be best if we just boom, gave it, you stood up and you watched and listened by turning your attention. So, you'll see as the gospel procession used to go out into the middle of the people would turn to be able to face the gospel procession.
Mhm.
And that's true in parishes that still do a gospel procession into the midst of the congregation. The prayer book is not clear on where you need to read from, but the pulpit lectern is a good place. Walking out among the people is a good thing. It's a prominent thing. So again, our body language is telling us a lot. We're standing, we're ready to hear, we're on our feet. And then when the lesson is finished and we say that, the gospel of the Lord, and the people say, praise to you, Lord Christ, we turn and put the gospel book where it belongs, and we go into the pulpit area and begin to explicate what was going on in the gospel. And then we have the people sit again. That's especially true if somebody's going to go for an hour.
Right.
I normally don't.
Right.
15 minutes and I'm gassed out.
Right.
I mean 15 minutes and my people are checking their watches in my church, and so that's another body language things that I've noticed.
Well, I have one question about that. You do two services, one at 8 and one at 10 on
Right.
Sundays. Do you give, after you give the 8 o'clock sermon, do you make adjustments for the 10 o'clock mentally or in your notes?
So I do a lot of preparation for my sermon work, take a lot of notes. I normally don't preach from notes. I normally preach from the story within me. And so if you were to listen to 2 sermons on any given week, there would be changes. Some of them are incidental. Some of them might be because of change of focus, that something came to me while I was preaching the first time to one group of people, that something needed to be said. And so in the second sermon, it might be slightly different. So disadvantage is if it's not written down, it's not the same sermon. If it's written down, I had a harder time early in my homiletics career, really responding to where the Spirit was. So I did. I mean, I have a whole notebook full of sermons for like 6 years. But I, with the help of a parishioner, sort of gradually walked away from preaching from notes. I will still put a reminder word or two in front of me, but generally speaking, no.
Interesting.
So that's just me. I don't recommend it for everybody, not because it can't be effective, but it's my internalized way of approaching this. So,
well, I will say your sermons always do reflect a high degree of preparation, but you don't make it effortful. It sounds like a very natural telling of the story. What you don't want to see, which I have seen, is a priest getting up to do the homily with a cocktail napkin, and notes sort of written in a spiral on the.
okay.
Yeah, it's like that doesn't assure me that you've really dug into the gospel and have something to tell me about it.
Or yeah, you're right. Though it might suggest where you were
exactly where he gets his inspiration, right?
Right.
So there comes a point in the service where we ask for forgiveness for our sins and we kneel.
Right.
You invite, the presider invites the congregation to come into a space of penance, and then the presider joins the congregation back to the congregation in our church, kneels down and recites a confession and a petition for forgiveness. So maybe that's just self-evident that if you're seeking forgiveness, you're in a penitential state and you would be kneeling. But is it done that way everywhere?
So the indication in the Book of Common Prayer is that you would kneel for penitential prayer. And a good adage would be we stand for public prayer, we sit to hear, and we kneel for penitential prayer.
Mm-hmm.
That is the general outline of the uh, Eucharistic rite two in the Book of Common Prayer. And there are four different
That's the
Eucharistic
overview.
prayers. Pardon me?
That's the overview of what
That's the
we're doing,
overview.
why
So
we're
if you're
doing it.
going through it and you're trying to figure out what you're doing, that's what you're doing. And,
So here's a question that occurred to me. We kneel and we petition,
right.
receive forgiveness. But then later in the service, during the liturgy of the Eucharist, we kneel during the Eucharistic prayer. Why do we do that?
So again, so again, there's a rubrical direction in both Rite 2 and Rite 1 after we sing the Sanctus or recite the Sanctus, the Holy, Holy, Holy.
Right.
And it says in Rite 1, the people stand or kneel for the rest of the prayer. And in Rite 2, it says the people, in Rite 1, it says the people kneel or stand. And in Rite 2, it says the people stand or kneel.
Huh.
So it's really interesting. I have a colleague, he wrote a pamphlet on this, and basically he was suggesting that it's an individual option. I would say, even though the rubrics don't state it that way, if you read the rubrics as intended, it's a congregational posture. So the whole congregation, the people, all y'all are the people, the celebrant is celebrating, but y'all are celebrants too. So it gets, I don't like that language anymore. So when in our local order of service, we call it the presider and the people, because I'm just presiding, but I do. So you're directed to kneel in morning prayer, Rite 1, because that was considered the most appropriate posture. Why was it considered the most appropriate posture? Well, in Rite 1, we're actually using the language and theology that was brought from the prayer book of 1928 and have moved it into the prayer book of 1979 to give traditionalists an option. Mm-hmm. So in the 28 prayer book, once you'd gotten past the Sanctus, you would have kneeled. That is exactly the kind of posture much of the Reform movement was trying to fight against, because it then takes on the aspect of personal piety in a group. Now, that may not be totally true, but I do think when we, sort of assume a more fetal position. No, we kneel and we put our arms up. I did this as a kid when I was in the Roman Catholic Church. You kneeled at that part in the service, and you put your hands here.
But it is like you're in a bubble. I know what you're talking about.
Right.
Putting yourself individually ready to receive communion, and
right.
I can see how you would say it closes you off a bit to the rest of the congregation.
And I think it invites that's a different piety. It's not a worse piety. It's not it's just a different kind of piety. But I do, especially in public worship, really appreciate the kind of piety that brings us all together. Mm-hmm. And so in Rite 2, we stand, and in that place, we continue to stand as redeemed people before God. We've heard the story, we've confessed, and we're just celebrating in that place. Mm-hmm. And so I think in standing, it's encouraging us to be open and aware to God. I'm clearly at a point, and was before I went to seminary, where I could, especially the Eucharistic prayers we use the most, I didn't really need the book anymore. And I could sit and see what was happening. Part of the encouragement is, even at the table, as we, you see the chalice, and you see the plate that the bread is on, and the presider is leading the prayer and doing manual acts, and the manual acts are basically assuming position of Iran's,
Mm-hmm.
which was an ancient position of prayer. So one of the things about praying with your hands folded, again, it's a very personal bubble forming sort of prayer, legit, wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
And the prayer, and you'll see pictures of this too, even in some ancient manuals, with people kneeling, but with their arms open
Mm-hmm.
toward God. And now, it would be really great if everybody in the congregation would assume the Oran's position, like they see the presider doing. It means we're all open to God and each other and what's happening in this moment, especially because we're asking God to be present. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a moment within most of the Eucharistic prayers in the prayer book 1979 that we would call the epiclesis, which is the specific moment, I know, very Western, that we say, at a minimum, this is when the Holy Spirit has arrived.
Mm-hmm.
I hope the Holy Spirit's been there for, but
Duration, right?
yeah, and but at least in this moment, we can make the assertion we've asked the Holy Spirit, and we believe that because two or three have been gathered, the Holy Spirit's there.
So if I'm the parishioner who decides, no, I'm going to stand during this part of the service, how does that play? Is that like not so good because you're standing out from the congregation? Is it distracting to you? How does that play out?
So that's that was more problematic before. So within our community, primarily most of the people, and especially a lot of Episcopalians by now, they want to stand. The folks who want to kneel are the minority, and it would seem odd to me if everybody was kneeling and somebody was standing. But I don't point those things out.
Okay.
I don't send the liturgical police
Okay.
to arrest them with canonical handcuffs and
Right.
take them away to liturgical prison. So, most people want to be part of the broader community, and when they look around and see they, maybe not right that day, but another day, they'll they tend to do it, and different communities are going to do it different ways. There was a time I thought, especially since we do this in Rite 1 in the service that you attend most often, that maybe during Easter we should stand for the Eucharistic prayer, and then the rest of the year kneel. But the habits are hard, and the piety is important to each part of our worship community. So for those who want to kneel, that's why I.
That's why we have kneelers.
Yep, and and I said this is the preference of this group, and there are some people don't immediately kneel you're doing the when you're doing the confession,
Right.
but I don't make anything. Most people eventually go, yeah, that feels right. So, and one of the reasons I actually walk out and kneel at the altar rail is we don't have any, we don't have any prayer desks. We have a very
Oh,
narrow place. In many churches, they do have little prayer desks right where the presider and everybody else is, and they just kneel there. And I'm looking for a place to kneel. And at my advanced age, I want to make sure I can get back up.
yes.
So there's a practical there's a spiritual reason for me to kneel and to be part of the community that's confessing. There's a practical reason why I come out where I come out. One is we don't have any place for me to kneel up there, and it's really hard to get up when
Yeah.
and yeah. So that's some of it. An admission of my part, my feebleness as a human.
Well, so we're coming up on our 30-minute self-imposed deadline, so I think we should move to the lightning round,
Okay.
where we get to know the upstanding rector a little bit. All
Okay.
right. So Gilligan's Island, which character are you?
Oh, I'm probably Gilligan.
Oh, okay. All right. Um, Short version of how you met your spouse.
Short version of how I met my spouse was we both worked at the same Georgia. Somebody won the World Series pool, and one of my close friends knew the guy, and he had invited people to go sit down in to go to a local small cheap Mexican restaurant to enjoy the his winnings with him. And so I got invited to go to dinner, and the person sitting across from me at dinner was Catherine.
Wow. So you're brought together by baseball. That's
Yeah,
nice.
and the name of the restaurant was El Azteca, and yeah, their nacho plate was pretty famous.
All right. So favorite sport to play, favorite sport to watch.
You broke up a little bit.
Favorite
Repeat.
sport to play, favorite sport to watch.
Oh, it's changed over time. So currently, my favorite sport to watch is hockey. I did not understand hockey, but when you had two kids play hockey growing up, you had to learn, and then you found out, oh wow, this is a really cool game.
Mhm.
So I love to watch hockey. It's fast. There's not a lot of scoring, but it's still fast. It's amazing, especially
Mhm.
Stanley Cup uh, hockey. The play once you hit the playoffs, it's insane. Favorite sport to play? I couldn't play hockey because I grew up in Virginia and we didn't have any
We
ice.
didn't have any ice.
Yeah, right. And I was too stupid to go to the school that taught you how to play lacrosse. I would say in the end, I loved playing baseball the best.
Mhm.
Football, I played it a lot, but think about it. That's such a sport that's crazy. You put on about 50 pounds of equipment. You go out in 95-degree heat to start two a days in Virginia, and you run around trying to club each other to death. And the reason you had asked me before we got together, yes, I'm having some neck pain. Yes, back when I was a high school football player, I did a thing and got a stinger. Even
Oh,
my doctor said yesterday, he goes, I haven't heard somebody use that phrase in a long time.
and
So
that's the where you
yeah,
hit your opponent here in the crook of your neck, and you pay for it later, huh?
right, because your head's separating from your shoulder.
Yeah, that'll do it.
It sounds really, and it does. It compresses a nerve, and it's like
Yeah,
it like numbs your arm, and little
right,
tingly things go up your arm, and
right.
yeah,
So it makes orans an effort.
yeah, it does. Or trying to finish off, your favorite beverage.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll leave it for there for this week. Thank you very much for listening to our podcast, and we'll be back. Oh,
Lightning
David.
round. Lightning round. We have to get to
Oh,
know the.
oh, okay. So
I
Gilligan's
think it's
Island.
fair that we should
Gilligan's
do.
Island, I would say Mary Ann, often more enthusiasm than brains.
Okay.
And then short version of how I met my spouse, we were fixed up at a cookout, and I didn't know it was fix up. So when he called a few days later to ask me out, I thought he was someone else, and I said yes. Um, but it all worked out. We've been together for 40 years.
So who confessed finally that they were actually setting you up when you didn't know it at the beginning, or did you?
Uh,
When did
the
you figure?
person on his end of the transaction said, "Oh
Okay.
yeah."
Okay.
So
Okay.
um, the guy who was on the husband who was on my end of the connection, I think probably would not be down with it. He was not a he was not a fixer upper guy. He was very, what you see is what you get. So,
Yeah.
and what was the other question? Oh, favorite sport to watch.
Play and favorite sport to watch.
Well, my favorite sport to watch is tennis,
Okay.
particularly women's tournament tennis. And my favorite sport to play is hiking and running and some weightlifting.
I think
So,
I think those are great sports. Yeah.
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 So,
That's what I'm limited to now. Oh, and I must say, I do like to ski, and I learned
yes.
how to ski as an adult. So I'm not natural at it, but I'm good enough to have some fun. So,
All right. Well, we will leave it there and look forward to bringing you another episode in the very near future. We haven't gotten it down to a particular schedule,
okay.
but we're going through our list of topics, and we're always interested. If you have one you'd like to have explored, please let us know by emailing me. You'll hear about this episode on email. All right. I'm going to sign off.